Hello, welcome to the second episode of Chinwags with the OCC. Today I have another question for our OCCs. So here's my question. Technology, innovation, and therefore fintechs are meant to bring financial services to the unserved and the underserved population. So do you think it is really working? Do you think fintechs are really bringing this financial inclusion into countries that have very diverse geography as well as a very huge disparity in terms of the wealth distribution, for example, like in the Philippines and Indonesia? Who would like to start first?
Well, I guess because I live here in the Far East, if we're looking at Indonesia and the Philippines, it's probably worth me kicking off. I think it's important to understand that the Philippines and Indonesia both have extraordinarily high levels of access to smartphones, incredibly high. And so there is a presumption that they're automatically going to be customers and find value in fintechs. And they do, but within reason. The first thing is that there's an awful lot of e-wallets in use. An incalculable number, because many people have multiple e-wallets. But they're not in use for a lot of people. There's even people who have smartphones. Many of them do not have credit on their phones for a lot of the week. The Philippines mobile phones are extremely expensive. And many people can only afford to be online for a few minutes a day or even a few minutes a week. If they can't find somewhere that has free Wi-Fi, and not many places do outside the major conurbations, then they have no access to fintech, none. So there's no point in trying to say that in the Philippines in particular, that there is the growth of 5G and all the other things that are available. The technology is available if people can afford to use it, if they can afford a phone. If they break their phone, they can't afford to get it replaced or repaired for months, which means they have no access to their money. And so the bottom line is that fintechs are great if you're in a city center, if you've got a good mobile phone system, and if you understand the technology. But I live 500 meters away from the head office of Malaysia's biggest bank. The stock exchange is at the end of my road, literally the end of my road. I've almost never have an effective mobile phone signal in my flat. So even when we're using two-factor authentication that relies upon an SMS, sometimes that SMS doesn't arrive for 5, 10, 15 minutes, by which time it has expired. And that's not even a fintech problem. That's the underlying technology problem that the industry has failed to identify when it's saying we can use fintech for financial inclusion. So yes, 18 to 50-year-olds living in the burbs, fine. You can't even use it in some of the shopping centers here because there's no signal inside the shopping centers. So is fintech the way of the future for ordinary people? No, it isn't.
That's an interesting take because you mentioned about the reception. I do face that issue in Singapore as well. There are certain places in the basement. The supermarket is in the basement. I can't use it. So what's your take on that, Des?
Mine, obviously it's your area, both you, Julia, and Nigel. For me, it does resonate with me because there's the other issue is that the definition of financial inclusion itself it implies an absence of a barrier to the services which fintechs or whatever are trying to provide. But the main part behind it is that the regulations, so we're talking about money laundering regulations, we're talking about regardless of the access to a mobile phone or the signal or the cost of owning a phone and having sufficient funds to be able to use and access the internet. Ignoring that, I just find that financial inclusion is probably, it's definitely aspirational, and I guess the question here is it attainable? Which is two different questions. I know that if you recall, the big issuer in the UK, the founder of the big issuer, John Bird, once said it's very expensive to be poor, because of the ability to be able to suggest that these financially excluded have access to mobile phone that costs money, and the telecom companies that provide those services, they want to make profits. And that's almost, we go back to the days of the M-Pesa in Kenya and around Africa. It was fine while the mobile network operators were happy to provide those services. But the bigger that business got, and it failed in many of the countries, especially bigger ones like South Africa itself, because the mobile network operators wanted to make a profit out of it as well. So it is difficult, and communication is one thing. For me, again, as I said, I talked about money laundering and whatever. The financial inclusion and the regulations that you've got require many people to have government IDs or fixed addresses. Well, how does that work under the definition of financial inclusion? And again, I'm going back to my normal thing. I'll ask a question, don't expect an answer, but I'm asking more questions. That's really my initial basis on that. Julia, thank you.
You don't have an address, how do you prove who you are?
Correct.
But that's been the problem for banks as well. But banks have been able to do it because you can walk in and say hello. At least you used to be able to before they closed all the branches. But that's not available to people using fintechs.
No. But also, just to finish off, the banks and the large financial institutions are very adept at lobbying and fighting to keep the competition down. So the fintechs that are coming in are having to justify and pay to be able to get into that market, to be able to supply that market. It's a bit of a...
I see absolutely no justification in saying just because you come along and say you're a fintech, you should be subject to lesser standards of security for your customers, lesser standards of regulation than if you said it was a bank. Changing the name above the door doesn't change the function. It doesn't change the risk.
No, but when it comes to financial inclusion, if you're offering a service for financial inclusion, there are things that are going to be different to the way the banks would operate it, and they don't really get involved with the financial inclusion, do they?
There have been attempts, though, haven't there, in the UK? Mark, you will no doubt remember the idea of the universal bank account. You know, we used to have the gyro at the post office until some idiot decided to privatize it.
Yeah.
And that was basically because it was like having a bank on every corner, because anyone could go into the post office and open a gyro account. Yes, you had to prove who you were, but you would be known because you would probably be walking in that post office 3 times a week to post letters and pick up parcels or do whatever it is you do at post offices. Although these days they seem to be more in the corner of a general store than an actual post office. But the lack of that kind of service, which did provide some kind of assistance, has been part of the problem. But then you can look ahead of that to where it nearly worked with Wirecard.
Yeah. If only Wirecard hadn't been a fraud.
Yes, exactly. But Wirecard was what was a bank account on a card.
Okay.
And the money was, but there was a bank account behind it. It wasn't just the card. There was an account behind it. So the government could pay benefits into the Wirecard, and people could go and take it out of an ATM free, or they could go and spend it in shops free.
Yeah.
So it was the closest people got to having cash on a card.
Yep.
And it actually worked.
So
Go for
another,
it, Dave.
so another question I would fire to that one would be, was there minimal balances? Was there dormancy fees? Was there overdraft fees? Because that's where financial inclusion falls down if you start
As
charging.
far as I know, there were no overdraft fees because they just didn't pay out any money, because it was a debit card with a zero overdraft facility. So if
But
there
we
was
have
no
got-
money on the card, you didn't get it.
Sorry, no, we've got to the stage where banks and fintechs see themselves making their money on marginal transactions. They all add up. And if you are on $1 a day in a country with severe overpopulation, undercapitalization, hand-to-mouth existence, and somebody is charging 10 cents on every transaction, you soon notice it. And the issue with all of this, as far as I'm concerned, one of the big things is that there is a big difference on trying to shoehorn a capitalist charge everything through the nose at every conceivable time and helping include people who are marginalized and cannot access financial services in a way that benefits them. To come back to Des's point, which is absolutely right, it's very expensive being poor in the UK. You get prepayment keys which are charged much higher for running your utility bills.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How the hell do you actually get people out of poverty when you are charging them and treating them like that? They then have to line up in queues.
But
to
it's
get
always been the
charged.
same with meters, though, hasn't it? If you,
Yeah,
if
Nigel, bear with me a second. I'm on a roll here.
Okay.
Banks and fintechs are very caught up at the moment with the ESG program of meeting the targets set by the Paris Climate Accord in 2016.
ESG meaning?
Environmental, social and governance. Thank you very much indeed. It's basically moving
I agree there.
capitalism onto a sustainable finance kind of basis. And the first 3 of those 17 Paris targets are no poverty, no hunger, let me just look it up because I'm going completely batty in my old age. 0 hunger, good health, and no poverty. Now, how do you actually get those into a system which charges you for everything? And if you look at the alternatives that are being explored, which are microfinance, which is big in Bangladesh, big in a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, and I believe is active both in Indonesia and in the Philippines, what happens is, as money pours in from investors who are going, we don't want to maximize returns, the institutions into which those funds are being channeled start to behave like banks, and they start charging for services, and they start debt recovery and all these sorts of things, which are basically, let's repeat a failed model. And unless you are actually going to start looking at this on the idea of actually you're not going to make a capitalistic return on this, it's difficult. Sorry, Nigel, I didn't want to talk over you, but I wanted to get those points in together.
No,
Because
I agree absolutely with the wonderful ideal behind what you're saying.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, unless you're going to have a charity and not one that's run by people whose head, whose CEO is fighting to get on the news so she can show off her Hermes scarf and say, please give your money to these starving kids.
Yeah.
The charity, if you're going to do that, it has to be a charity, and the people who are giving the money have to realize they're giving it, they're not going to get it back.
Yeah.
Is charity a sustainable? I mean, I don't like the word sustainable in normal use because I think it's misused. But in this context, it is. Is it a sustainable model for a bank-like organization to be giving grants and not expecting giving grants is one thing, but to be making loans and then saying to the population at large, but don't worry if you can't repay because we have a policy of debt forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's an oxymoron. Effectively, we are actually trying to shoehorn the wrong solution into an area that we've identified as a problem. It's exactly where charities ought to be running and ought to be involved. But before I go down this particular rabbit hole and take us all with it, I just want to say, Julia, what do you think in terms of how we're trying to address these issues that you're keen to sort of ensure have solutions? Are we in the right area?
Well, I think that when it comes to financial inclusion, you're right. You know, it is very expensive to be poor. Well, how I see that this is going to help is that it's definitely not going to be the capitalists putting funding all these financial institutions that are lending out to the poor, because I noticed that the charges are high, the interest rates are high. So it will have to be a balance of both, perhaps self-sustaining social enterprise. Could it be a partially charities or not charities really? Because there is a danger about charities sometimes, the way that some of the larger charities that we are aware of, I wonder whether they are using their funds in the correct way. That's
different
a story for another day. Stories for another day. So it will have to be a good balance of perhaps with the capitalists. It is part of the social responsibility to put some funds aside where they will not be expecting to make a lot of money out of them.
Can I
Can I throw in something that is going to sound really weird to everybody? What we're really talking about, if we take this to a way that it would work, is to abandon the idea of globalization, of national approaches, and to deal with everything on a village basis, where people help each other. They don't charge each other rip-off. There's help rather than money flowing in many ways, which means that effectively we're moving towards something akin to time banking, if there's going to be any banking at all, or there's got to be a system, which is where it gets really interesting, of favors and repaying favors. Explain how we get away from corruption when that's the case.
Can pop in on that one. If we went back to the original UK banking system 200 years ago, they were set up by local religious organizations, Quakers, for example, Methodists, and you used religion to identify those within your local area for whom you could actually help. Now, all those have gone on to become large, major international banks, sacrificing quite a lot of that on the way. But it does strike me that we are dangerously going back to, as you rightly suggest, local areas, local solutions, but you do get the corruption problem. As with most transformational issues, you transform the problem, but you also transform the risks, and people stop thinking, well, we've addressed the problem, what about, and they think there are no risks with that. All of it comes with risks and thought.
And the danger of that is that the old checklists that we use for the old risks don't apply anymore.
They don't work at all. Yeah.
No.
So if that's the case, coming back to the original topic, which is the reason why we're here, how can fintech create that? How can fintech support that very low cost model of helping people to help themselves? Is it possible?
I think the short answer is yes, it is, but you don't do it at a time of rising interest rates. This is what should have been happening 10 years ago. Instead, it went into all sorts of weird and wonderful things like secondary property markets and all sorts of whizzy great new yachts for the super rich. I'm very cynical about this. It is possible, but you actually need stubborn, pig-headed people who say, no, I'm not going to make myself independently wealthy. No, I'm not going to try and influence political outcomes. I'm actually going to do something that benefits people.
So the Cadburys and the Rowntrees and the Fries and the people who made the soap powder. And, yes, we're going to be rich, but and yes, we're going to be stinking rich. But at the end of the day, we're going to make sure the people who are in our club, the ones who work for us, are housed well, fed well, and looked after properly.
Yep.
No one will be left behind. So we have 2 more minutes to wrap up.
So what world are we in then? I just don't get it. I mean, we're talking about a kind of world that I'm not sure exists. I mean, I know it's very easy to be negative on this, and the very nature of the formal system of regulatory and institutionalized banks makes it exclusionary and non-flexible. So the answer to your question, Julia, is fintechs need to do something, but they're going to be beaten down by the very institutions that are adept at lobbying and fighting to keep the competition away. we may not have the answer in 15 minutes. That's all I can say. Where I then suggest maybe we may need it on another time to talk about what I call consensual identification sponsorship.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the ability to provide the government stuff. Maybe that's somewhere we need to go and talk about later, but I'd rather leave that in the air for the moment.
The only thing I can think of, Des, immediately is, isn't this a role for the supranationals? Isn't this exactly where the money being transferred from the wealthier countries to the nations that need development support actually ought to be going, rather than pet projects that may or may not have an impact, and usually don't, and come with large corruption risks sitting across them?
Are you suggesting we go, the British go back to the old empire days? I'm not sure that.
No. Let's do it the Chinese Empire way. I'm sure it'll be much better. It's going to be interesting.
Yep. So let's save this for the next episode.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Julia.